Bonnie and Clyde were infamous outlaws in the United States starting in the early 1920s up until their eventual death after a life of crime. I'm going to talk a little bit about Clyde Barrow and how his life leading up to his criminal life probably led him to the life of crime that he had. I'm going to start with his father, Henry Barrow. He was born in 1873 in Pensacola, Florida. He was a very sick child and only attended one day of school his entire life, so he did never learn how to read or write. At a young age, Henry, Clyde's father, moved to Texas with his parents, where his parents became tenant farmers. So tenant farming is where you rent land from a landowner and pay a percentage of your crop yields to the landowner. Typically, tenant farmers don't have enough money when they start out, so they have to buy all of their seed and other materials on credit from the store owner, who, ironically enough, is typically the landowner. Henry's parents did not make a lot of money doing tenant farming. Henry didn't like tenant farming at first, and he was usually too sick to help out, so he liked to go bet on ponies at the racetrack until his father convinced him that that wasn't a very good thing and that he needed to kind of take on the family tradition of farming. So Henry did do that, and he started going to church, and his eventual dream was to be a farmer. Henry wanted to be able to buy a lot more of these supplies outright, so he got a job at a sawmill to try to save up some money. And there he met Cumie Walker, who was his eventual wife and Clyde's mother. So they married in 1891 at the young ages of 17 and 18 years old. Cumie, or Clyde's mother, her father was a farmer, so he supported Henry's dream of being a farmer. So they ended up, renting some land, and they had 7 children. Their most famous children are Buck Barrow, Nell Barrow, and Clyde Barrow. So, having 7 children, Cumie had to spend a lot of time in the house taking care of the children, so she was not able to help Henry on the farm. Obviously, the more children you have, the more mouths you have to feed, which can be expensive. So there were times where the children would be sent to live with relatives of Henry or Cumie, and there the kids would help on their relatives' farms, but Henry and Cumie wouldn't have to feed them then. Clyde was born in March of 1910. His sister, who wrote a book about Clyde and Bonnie, described their conditions growing up. They were obviously very poor. They worked a lot on the farm. They didn't have a lot of food, and they spent a lot of time watching their younger siblings. There was no time to dream about the future. There was just thoughts of, how they were going to survive. Clyde was really close to his sister Nell and his mother, and also his older brother Buck. They were a close-knit family, and they stuck up for each other. And at 6 years old, Clyde was reported to have said that his dream job was to be an outlaw criminal. So during these younger years, Clyde and his siblings would scrape together pennies and go to the movies. So during this time, a lot of the movies were movies about the Wild West and outlaws such as Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, and Billy the Kid. Jesse James and Billy the Kid came to be idols that Clyde looked up to. His older brother, Buck, dropped out of school in the 3rd grade because he did not enjoy going to school. Clyde kind of became a naughty kid from the beginning. He would hold grudges, and if other kids beat him up, he would not take it very well, and he would wait until later when he would be able to beat them up. So at the end of World War I, things were not financially good for farmers in the United States. Farmers in Europe had started to farm again, and supply and demand issues had changed drastically at the end of the war. So a lot of tenant farmers were not making any money at all because the landowners were also losing money. So they were asking for higher percentages from their tenant farmers on the yield of their crops. So a lot of tenant farmers at the time decided to get out of tenant farming because they, the ultimate goal was to eventually own your own land. But if the landowners were not even making money, then what was the point of having that as their dream? So a lot of tenant farmers did give up farming and move to cities where they thought that they would, prosper in the industrialized areas and work in factories and things like that. So Cumie and Henry kind of tried to hold on a little bit longer than most people, but then the boll weevil crisis of 1920 happened, and this pest destroyed all of the cotton. So in 1922, they did move to Dallas, which is where a lot of their older children, including Buck and Nell, were already living. So when they moved to Dallas, Clyde was 12. So Dallas was kind of split into Dallas City proper and West Dallas, which was the slum area where a lot of the, immigrants were moving to Dallas. So the west side was the city slum, kind of the area next to the factories and things like that. And the rest of Dallas was filled with, the rich, more middle class kind of people. And Dallas wanted to become one of the major cities, so they wanted to prosper in the industrialized world the way that it was developing, and they wanted to develop a lot of, higher profile social aspects in their city, such as the symphony, the opera, the zoo, and things like that. So they were looking to expand their population, but they were looking to expand their population with people that had money to spend on those kinds of activities, not poor people like Henry and Cumie Barrow, who didn't have any money and were escaping, the downfall of tenant farming. So a lot of the people that were flooding to Dallas were like Henry and Cumie. They were former farmers. They did not have a lot of skills. They did not have a lot of money, and a lot of them were illiterate or very close to it. So Dallas's population had doubled between 1905 and 1910 and surpassed 100,000 people around 1920, which was right before the Barrows arrived in 1922. So a lot of the people there, were there to seek out this American dream, which obviously wasn't going to happen for them. In West Dallas, or Cement City, which was right by the cement factory, that was the slums. There was no electricity, no sewage, no running water, no paved roads. The people were sleeping in tents. It was obviously very dirty. There was a lot of health issues going around, and there was a lot of crime. The Barrows actually slept under their wagon for several years. There was not enough unskilled jobs to go around, so a lot of the people in West Dallas and Cement City were scrounging and trying to make money. Obviously, Henry didn't have a lot of skills. He was illiterate, so he eventually decided that he was going to collect scrap metal. So he would hook up the horse and wagon every day and go through people's trash and find, scrap metal. And this was kind of the beginning era of people owning personal cars. So there were a lot of discarded car parts that he was able to collect that he could, turn into scrap metal. Clyde hated this because a lot of the other kids would make fun of him and call his dad the garbage man because he was literally going through people's trash. But a lot of the other people around the same time were also scrounging to make money or provide for their families by legitimate means. Some of the families would walk miles every day into the city to go work in these factories for, pennies a day. Another thing that people started to do was to obviously steal. If you're, trying to feed your family and make money and there's no legitimate options for you, you have to, come up with something. So they'd either steal from each other or they would go into Dallas and start stealing from the rich. Cumi was worried that this, culture of crime in the slum would impact her children. At that point, Buck had already dropped out of school, so she kind of thought he was a lost cause. Clyde was around 15, and he decided that he wasn't satisfied with his life in, West Dallas. He wanted to be accepted and respected in the city of Dallas, and he became obsessed with fancy clothes, fancy cars. He felt like those things were a sign of status, and that they would, allow people to respect him if he had them. So Clyde dropped out of school at 16 and decided that he was going to try to get a job because he wanted nice clothes, he wanted a car, he wanted to go and live in Dallas. His first job that he worked, he was making about $1 a day. He had a few other jobs that he tried, and it wasn't making him any money, but he wanted out of his life in West Dallas. And he was slightly resentful towards his father because, his father was in his 40s by then, and he really had nothing to show for his life. They were living in the slums of West Dallas, and he wasn't even, hardly able to provide for his kids. And Clyde didn't want that. He also tried to join the Navy, but he was rejected due to a medical issue, which discouraged him even more because he thought that the Navy would accept him for who he was and accept the fact that he wanted to fight for his country. And when the Navy rejected him, Clyde took it very personally, and he felt judged. He also saw the other youth in West Dallas making money by stealing things, and this is when he decided that a life of crime was more profitable and lucrative than having a legitimate job, earning measly wages. So if you compare Clyde Barrow's teenage life to the Chicago school, it makes a lot of sense as to why Clyde Barrow turned out the way that he did. The Chicago school views crime as a social problem, and that industrial growth caused problems in urban areas, and the increased population of city slums led to a very disorganized social environment. And a lot of these people who live in the slums, including Clyde Barrow and his family, knew that the American dream, wasn't destined for them. It wasn't for people like them, because there was so little opportunity for them to get out of the circumstances that they were in. I'm going to take a little look at Sean McKay's theory of juvenile delinquency as it applies to Clyde Barrow. If you take a look at Ernest Burgess's zone theory, it applies perfectly to the situation in Dallas. So there is obviously the divide between the upper and middle classes in Dallas and West Dallas, which was the slum. It was literally divided by the river. The poor were stuck living in West Dallas and Cement City, which was geographically cut off from, the more urban, upper middle class part of the city. They were surrounded by the factories, and the crime rate was obviously very high in West Dallas, and it was much lower across the river in the rest of the city of Dallas. Sean McKay theorized that crime rates were higher in the slum areas, or the areas of transition, because the youth in the slums were not supervised as much as the youth in upper and middle class families, which was definitely true for Clyde. Cumi was busy raising children, and Henry was busy trying to do anything that he could to put food on the table and to provide for his family. Shaw and McKay also theorized that social institutions like schools were broken down in the slum areas. So in West Dallas, the school system was much different than that in Dallas. And a lot of kids weren't pushed to attend school, and if they dropped out of school, nobody really thought anything differently. And a lot of them had to drop out of school to get jobs because, they were expected to then help try to provide financially for their families. And their parents were too busy, trying to scrape together a few cents and put food on the table. So the children were left to do whatever they wished, which usually meant not going to school. Shaw and McKay also believed that there was no guiding force from stopping these youth in these slum areas from seeking excitement and seeking out friends who were probably not great friends because they were, allowed to just roam the streets. Normal social controls did not exist in West Dallas. This was a very disorganized society. This disorganization pushed Clyde Barrow towards a life of crime and eventually cemented his place in history next to his idols, the outlaws, Jesse James and Billy the Kid.